Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so we are going to continue our study in the book of Romans, and we're going to look at Romans chapter 11 today. And we are zipping right through, and we're gonna be done with this book before you guys know it, because the last few chapters they're not very hard. After this, it gets pretty. It's like application, so it's pretty simple to understand. This is still some theology. This is probably the last chapter that's like deep theology, I think. So, Romans chapter 11, and before we look at it, I wanted to remind everyone that really, Romans chapters 9 through 11 are really one unit. It's just really, it's one section really, and you can tell by the theme of it. So I want to look at just a couple verses, actually one verse from each chapter, except for Romans 9. We'll look at the first 4 verses. So can someone read Romans 9, 1 through 4? Just to get the subject of it.
Romans 9.
Romans 9, 1 through 4.
I tell the truth in Christ, I am not lying. My conscience also bearing me witness in the Holy Spirit, that I have great sorrow and continual grief in my heart. For I could wish that I myself were accursed from Christ for my brethren, my countrymen according to the flesh, who are Israelites, to whom pertain the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the service of God, and the promises.
Okay. So who is this talking about?
The Israelites?
Israel, right?
Right?
Okay. Now let's go to the next chapter, and can someone read just the first verse? Romans 10:1.
Brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they may be saved.
Okay, now who's that about?
Israel.
So Romans 9 is about Israel. Romans 10 is about Israel.
Mhm.
Let's look at Romans chapter 11 and verse 1. Read that for us, please.
I say then, has God cast away his people? Certainly not, for I also am an Israelite, the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin.
Alright, so what's Romans chapter 11 about?
Israel.
Israel. So we see the beginning of each one of these chapters, and throughout these chapters, we see one overriding topic. Israel.
Israel.
And so Romans chapter 11 really, or chapters 9 through 11 is really one unit. Chapter 8 kind of ends his whole righteousness by faith talk, and he's still talking about it the rest of the book. I mean, it's the theme of the whole Bible, it's the gospel. But he's really focusing on Israel in Romans chapter 9 through 11. And grace versus works as it relates to Israel, but it's really, the subject is Israel. Okay, so this is where it's going to get interesting. What Paul does is he uses Israel to teach us many lessons. Israel is an object lesson for the world to teach us many lessons. And so Romans chapter 11 is kind of his conclusion on the subject of Israel. And we're going to see that it is probably out of all the chapters, at least in Romans, and maybe in throughout the whole Bible, Romans 11 is the chapter that destroys the idea of Calvinism, which is we've been dealing with throughout the week, throughout this study. Calvinism, and on top of that, the idea of once saved, always saved. So Calvinism and once saved, always saved. You know, I wonder how many people in the Christian world believe in each one of these. I would imagine the once saved, always saved is more popular than Calvinism. But I wonder how many people believe once saved, always saved. Good people, you know, a lot of good Christians, but these topics, these things are not biblical. So we will see not Calvinists, but Calvinism is incorrect. And it's going to be very clear from Romans chapter 11. So here's how we're going to do this. We've seen what Calvinism is before, but I want to highlight just 2 points, or 3 points about it. And then we're going to go through the chapter and see how it's refuted in this chapter. So, Calvinism, put this here. is really based on what's called double predestination, in a sense. There are a group of people who are called the elect, and those are the people who are saved. Right? You guys remember this term, the elect? It means the chosen. Those are the people that God has chosen, and they're the saved ones. And the rest are hardened, and they are lost. So the elect are the ones who are saved eternally, and God decided who they are before the world even existed. And the lost, God hardens them. They have no opportunity to be saved, so they're lost eternally. And God decided before everything that these people were going to be lost. So two groups, the elect and the lost, which are hardened. Now, and this is, you guys remember this big theological term, determinism. Everything's determined beforehand. Okay. Versus, what would be the other option?
Choice.
Choice, absolutely. Free will or choice.
Well, once saved, always saved is kind of like that too.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Well, because Calvinism teaches once saved, always saved.
Mm-hmm.
If you are one of the elect, you will be saved. In fact, they have a term for it. It's perseverance of the saints. So if God decides that you're going to be saved, He is going to preserve you and make sure that you are going to be saved, because He decided you are going to be saved. There's no way around it.
So it's kind of like once lost, always lost today.
Absolutely. The ones who are hardened, they're done.
Yeah, once they're hardened, they're done.
Yeah, and there's no hope for them. So, and they get that from Romans 9 with the example. Do you remember who was the object lesson of the ones who are hardened?
Pharaoh?
Pharaoh. Absolutely. Okay, so keep that. So Pharaoh was hardened and he's lost for eternity. And then the elect, God chooses them. They're the elect. They're saved eternally. Boom. There's no way out of these two camps. Right? Romans 11 says otherwise. Okay, so now let's go through the passage. Let's start, let's look at verse 7. Somebody read verse 7 for us. And it starts off, not too far off from what Calvinists would think. Romans chapter 11, verse 7. Someone read that?
Different version, but so this is the situation. Most of the Jewish have not found the favor of God. They are looking for so earnestly. A few have the ones God has chosen, but the rest were made unresponsive.
Interesting. So the rest were made unresponsive. What's the word yours uses, baby?
Hardened.
Hardened. The ESV uses hardened. The King James says they were blinded. It's the same idea, unresponsive, blinded. But the one that reminds us of Romans 9 is hardened. The rest were hardened, right? So that would sound a whole lot like Pharaoh, who was hardened in Romans chapter 9. So these are people who, according to Calvinism, the hardened ones are the lost eternally, right? Mm-hmm. Now let me read it to you in this version here. Here's the ESV. What then? Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking. Israel. The elect obtained it. Now who are the elect? According to Calvinism.
Saved eternally.
These are the ones who are saved eternally. Good morning. But the rest were hardened. So there's a group who are saved. They're the elect. Good morning. We're in Romans 11. And then the rest were hardened. They're eternally lost. Two groups, right? Now, it's talking about Israel, remember? So the majority of the Jews, the majority of Israel were hardened, but a small group are saved out of both Jews and Gentiles, right? Okay. But keep in mind, it's saying that the majority of Israel here is hardened. And then there's the elect. Okay. Now let's go to verse 11. Speaking still of these Jews who were hardened, because in In verse 7, it ends by saying they were hardened, and then it goes on, as it is written, and it gives a couple of verses talking about the Jews being hardened and not understanding when the Messiah came. Let their table be a snare and a trap, so forth. Let their eyes be darkened that they cannot see. Okay, and then verse 11, he asks a question. So in verse 11 he says, "So I ask, did they stumble in order that they might fall? By no means. Rather, through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles, so as to make Israel jealous." So that's the ESV. King James says, "I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? God forbid, but rather through their fall, salvation has come to the Gentiles to provoke them to jealousy." I'll read one more, just to give multiple versions here. Here's the... this version requires the internet. Stop working for me. Here's the NLT. Even the NLT won't work for me. I'm sorry. The version's not working. Anyway, the idea is, have they stumbled that they should fall? Other versions basically say the idea is, have they stumbled to the point where they cannot recover? Good morning. And then Paul says, God forbid. Mm-hmm. So here we have Israel, the majority of Israel who did not accept Christ, were hardened. But in verse 11, Paul says, did they stumble so that they, to the point where they cannot recover? And what's the answer? No. So are we talking about, when Paul says people are hardened, is he talking about people who are lost eternally?
No.
No. This is a temporary situation. Now does this make us...
Some of them.
Some of them.
Yeah.
It depends.
Yeah.
And he tells us what their depending is, whether what's the difference. And it's not whether or not God just decides to make them hardened or not hardened. He tells us later on in the chapter what the difference is. So right away we have some problems with Calvinism. Because here we have people who are hardened, and now he's saying they might. They're not without hope. Do you guys get that from verse 11?
Mm-hmm.
They're not without hope. Okay. Actually, can somebody read verse 11 through 14?
So I asked, did they stumble in order that they might fall? By no means. Rather, through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles, so as to make Israel jealous. Now, if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? Now I'm speaking to you Gentiles. Inasmuch then as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry in order somehow to make my fellow Jews jealous and thus save some of them.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's good.
So they were hardened in early on, verse 7 I think it was, they were hardened, and now he's saying, well, some of them might be saved.
Yeah.
That's not Calvinism. That doesn't work. On top of that, notice how he's describing them possibly being saved. What is he saying that might happen to them?
They get jealous of the Gentiles?
Exactly. That would make absolutely no sense if we're talking about Calvinism, because Calvinism says you have irresistible grace, God chooses you, and he changes your heart, and you automatically want to follow him. Right? But what Paul's saying is that something's happening where the kingdom of God, a bunch of Gentiles are going to get saved, and he's hoping that the Jews will see this and be jealous and may want to learn about the Messiah and be saved themselves. Now that idea is, he's talking about somebody making a choice because they're jealous to want to join the faith as well. That is not irresistible grace, like the Calvinists would say, you're just changed. So it just doesn't fit at all. So we see that this hardened group is not a group that is just eternally lost, that many of them can be saved. It's possible. Okay, now can somebody read verses 17, this is a little bit of a long passage, 17 through 24, 7 verses. And Paul gives an object lesson here. This is the olive tree object lesson. And now, this one in particular is going to destroy this concept of once saved, always saved. Mm-hmm. Can somebody read 17 through 24, please?
And if some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them, and with them became a partaker of the root of the fatness of the olive tree, do not boast against the branches. But if you do boast, remember that you do not support the root, but the root supports you. You will say then, branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. Well said, because of unbelief they were broken off, and you stand by faith. Do not be haughty, but fear, for if God did not spare the natural branches, He may not spare you either. Therefore consider the goodness and severity of God on those who fell severity, but toward you, goodness. If you continue in His goodness, otherwise you also will be cut off. And then also, if they do not continue in unbelief, will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them again. For if you were cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and were grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these who were natural olive branches be grafted into their own olive tree?
Wow, that's good.
Pretty interesting, huh? If our Calvinist friends would just read two more chapters, they would see the whole idea that
It is, yeah, people don't like this idea of fallen and then saved, and then fallen and
They don't
then
like
saved,
it.
but it's like, that's what's
It's
saying
very
right
clear.
here.
It's very clear.
Yeah.
Well, why would you not like the idea of saved and then you could possibly still be lost after that? Why would people not like that idea? What do you think?
Well,
I mean, it's pretty obvious, huh?
yeah.
What do you think?
It means you, I don't know, it means you're not once saved, always saved. It's not guaranteed.
They just want to have a simple, I think it's just more simple to think, if I'm saved, then I'm saved. And there's no consequences for my actions.
That's part of it, absolutely. It's appealing to the human heart to think, hey, I believed once, years ago. I mean, not that they don't believe still today, but I'm good. I don't have to worry about it. And the idea that you could still be lost, that is uncomfortable for some people.
Yeah.
And they don't want to believe it, no matter how much Bible is there. So let's look back at the verses here. So this is a beautiful object lesson, very simple. And I'm just kind of try to illustrate this a little bit, as horribly as my illustration is, but imagine you have a tree, right? There's my roots. And olive tree is not a very good olive tree, but, and it has some branches. Whatever, leaves, whatever, horrible, right? And you have branches that are cut off, broken off, right? And so they're taken away, broke a branch off. And then you have other branches that are put back in, or put in for the first time. So this would be like the Gentiles. They're taken from, I don't know if you guys know how this works. This was probably common knowledge back then, but nowadays maybe not so much. But you take a branch from another tree, you cut that off, and you can actually put it onto to a different tree, and it will connect if you tie it together nice and tight. Good morning.
Hi,
Good morning. Nice to see you. Please join us. I think we have a couple more seats. We're in Romans chapter 11. Please join us. So we're in Romans 11. We're looking at the olive tree concept that Paul gives. So he's saying, look, we have the Gentiles who come from a wild olive tree. It's not the nice cultivated one that has been taken care of. It's just this wild growing one, right? And you take one of their branches and you put it onto this good stock. This is the original good cultivated olive tree. Which, by the way, who is the trunk?
Jesus.
Jesus is the trunk. Yeah. And he says, I'm the vine, you're the branches, right? So you plug the Gentiles in, right? Now they're connected to Christ, they're saved. But Israel, And not all of Israel, because he says at the beginning, not all Israel is lost, because Paul is, what? What's his nationality?
He's Jew.
He's a Jew. So not all Israel, because Paul was saved. But the nation in general and the majority of them rejected Christ. So in general, Israel's broken off. Gentiles are grafted in. And Paul goes and he says, verse 19, but thou wilt say, the branches, Israel, were broken off, that I might be grafted in. This is the Gentile speaking, that I might be grafted in. Verse 20, well, because of what? Unbelief they were broken off. And you are standing, or you're in good standing, by what? By faith. Not by works, by faith. Be not high-minded, but fear. So this is something for our friends who believe once saved, always saved. Should you just be walking around proud and high-minded that you're saved and you're good? No, he says rather fear. Why? For if God spared not the natural branch, that's Israel, the natural branches, take heed, lest he also not spare thee. Behold therefore the goodness and severity of God on them which fell, that's the Jews who rejected Christ, severity. But toward thee goodness, if thou continue in his goodness. Otherwise, thou also shalt be cut off. So is it possible, according to this passage, that somebody who is saved could also be cut off later?
Yes.
Absolutely. And I don't know how people can read this passage and still believe in once saved, always saved. It's very clear. I mean, some people will tell themselves, well, Paul's speaking hypothetically. It can't ever happen. But why would he tell you fear, take heed? God could also cut you off if it's never possible for it to happen. That just doesn't make any sense. I mean, the whole tenor of the passage just doesn't make sense, if that's the case.
Well, whenever Christ speaks in parables, they're, there's a really clear interpretation, and you kind of have to just take it.
The simplest.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
It is fairly simple. And he goes on, for if thou wert cut off verse 23. And they also, if they abide not still in unbelief, shall be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in. So these ones, this is Israel again, and they were, earlier he says they are hardened. He says God is able to graft them in again. If what? If God decides they're going to be the chosen? No. If they abide still not in unbelief. That's the difference. Whether or not they stay in unbelief or not. So here, these ideas of some group that is chosen by God and eternally elect, and there's just no way around it. That's just not biblical, because these people, these Gentiles were saved, and Paul says, hey, if you don't stay in faith, God will cut you off too. So this idea of eternally elect, no, that's not biblical. And this idea of eternally lost people, that God decides these people are lost, they're hardened, they have no choice, not biblical either. They could be grafted in again. So both of these ideas of Calvinism and once saved, always saved are just destroyed by this. And let's look at one more point. Oh, here's another interesting side note. I don't know if you guys remember in Romans chapter 8 where it talks about those he foreknew, then he justified, or then he called, and then he justified, and then he glorified. Calvinists will say, well, there it is. God knew them beforehand, chose them, and he made sure that they were going to go through these stages to be saved. But in verse 2, Paul in Romans 11 refers to Israel, who he later says are hardened, as those he foreknew. It just means he knew them beforehand. He knew, before in the past he knew who they were. Right? It doesn't mean necessarily that they're the ones who are automatically saved. That's just a side point. Okay. And then the last thing I want to notice is at the end of this, toward the end of this chapter, we see an argument against the idea of limited atonement. Does anyone know what limited atonement is? Does anyone remember that? Anybody? Any idea? What do you guys guess?
Christ only died for a few people in the cross?
Exactly. That's what it means.
Uh-huh.
It is this idea, and it's not biblical, that Jesus only died for the elect.
Who believe?
Isn't
Who
that?
believe in him?
Calvinists believe this. Calvinists. So you've heard the tulip, T-U-L-I-P, that's the L, limited atonement. Not all Calvinists believe this. Some Calvinists believe in that Jesus died for everyone, but still there was no hope for the ones who are hardened, which doesn't make sense that he would die for some that would have there's no possibility, but still. So this idea of limited atonement is that Jesus only died for certain people, the elect, which is not biblical. Jesus died for everyone, whosoever will, right? But let's see a verse that proves this wrong. At the end of Paul's argument here, in verse, let's see, 32. Look at verse 32. Someone read verse 32 for us, please.
For God has found everyone over to disobedience so that he may have mercy on them all.
All right. So God has concluded, or what did it say, found? Bound. My version has concluded. What is it? Does anyone else have a different word?
Committed?
Committed. The idea is concluded, I think is a little bit clearer, but it's he's seen that everyone has gone into unbelief or disobedience. So does that everyone? Everyone in the world has disobeyed at some point, right? That would include everybody, right? So if the word all there refers to everybody in the beginning of that passage, then what does it refer to at the end of the passage when it says that he might have mercy on all? Who would be the all there?
Everyone.
Everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's two alls in this passage. Two alls. And if the first all refers to the entire planet, then guess what? The second one also refers to the entire planet. So that means God has mercy on everyone. If you want to say that God doesn't have mercy on everyone, then you got to say that the first all doesn't mean everyone. So not everyone's disobedient. Would you argue that? I don't think so. That doesn't make sense. So we see that this passage does not work with this idea of limited atonement. God has mercy on all. He's concluded all in disobedience that he might have mercy on all. It's a much more beautiful picture of God. And the difference is, again, not works, but faith. That's the difference. If you stay in faith, you stay in Christ, then you will stay grafted in. If Israel, who disbelieved, decides to believe now, they can be grafted in again and connected to Christ again. That's the difference. Does anybody have any questions on this? Any final thoughts? Which, by the way, without going into it much more because we don't have time, but think of now, this makes Pharaoh make a lot more sense. Pharaoh was an object lesson for Israel. Pharaoh was a man who was disobedient, and God knew he would be disobedient, but God still used him to make his name known throughout the whole world. What about Israel? Israel was a nation that was disobedient to God. God knew they would be disobedient, but he still used their disobedience to make his name known throughout the whole world. So it doesn't have anything to do with choosing who's going to be saved and who's going to be lost. It has to do with God's working his purpose out through a group of people. And they can be cut off, they can be saved, depends on whether or not they believe. Make sense? Okay. Let's close, and the next few chapters will be a lot simpler. I think we're done with most of the deep theology stuff. Can somebody say a word of prayer for us, please?
I'll say,
Please.
Dear Father.